My name is Jeremiah Poop. For 21 years, I've been a tour guide on Boston's historic Freedom Trail. It's been the adventure of a lifetime. People often ask me how I became a tour guide. It certainly wasn't what I'd planned on doing for a career. Oddly, the person who first suggested that I become a tour guide was one of the actors from the 1975 blockbuster movie Jaws. But it wasn't Richard Dreyfuss, Roy Scheider, or Robert Shaw. It was Chris Rebello. Unless you're from Martha's Vineyard, you've probably never heard of him, but if you've seen Jaws, then you've seen Chris. Chris played Michael Brody, the eldest son of Amity Police Chief Martin Brody. Jaws was filmed in 1974 on Martha's Vineyard. Chris was a local kid from Oak Bluffs. Jaws would be his first and only movie appearance. Christopher Reed Rebello was born on Martha's Vineyard on May 8, 1963, the youngest of the four children of Anthony Rebello and his wife, Marilyn Comber Rebello. They were of Portuguese descent, although Chris also had Mayflower and Wampanoag ancestry through his maternal grandmother. Chris was an extremely well-liked kid. He was mischievous at times, but by all accounts had a very big heart. During his years at Martha's Vineyard Regional High School, Chris was a star athlete. He excelled at basketball, football, baseball, hockey, and swimming. Chris graduated high school in 1981. A few years later, he married and fathered 3 children. He would go on to be the assistant coach of the Martha's Vineyard Regional High School football team. He became a role model, a mentor, and even a father figure to many of the students that he coached. My one and only encounter with Chris Rebello occurred in the spring of 2000. He was a chaperone for one of his kids' school trip to Boston. They visited the Old State House Museum where I was a cashier. The job was uninspiring and I felt like a failure. I ended up having to give the school group a talk about the Old State House's history. Afterwards, Chris told me the kids had been riveted and that I would make an excellent tour guide. I told him I'd never been to Martha's Vineyard. He said the island had a lot of cool history and that I should visit. He even offered to show me around and introduce me to tour guides on the island. Chris wrote down his name and number and told me to give him a call if I ever wanted to visit. I saw his name and asked him if he'd been in the movie Jaws. He laughed and said he had and that I must be a hardcore Jaws fan to have heard of him. I told him I loved Jaws, but that wasn't why I'd heard of him. My grandparents had been friends with his parents, Anthony and Marilyn, back when I was a kid. His father, Anthony Rebello, known as Tubby to his friends, was born and raised in a close-knit Portuguese-American family in Oak Bluffs. He became the owner of Anthony's, a popular restaurant. He also served his community as town moderator and a selectman. And, although only a few people knew it, Anthony Tubby Rebello was also a hero because in 1977 he saved my uncle's life. When he was 14, my uncle Johnny had survived an accident that took the lives of 3 of his friends. Afterwards, he suffered from survivor's guilt and depression and fell into drug addiction. When he was trying to kick his heroin habit, he decided he needed to get away from all his drug connections in the Worcester, Massachusetts area where he was from. My grandparents had friends who had a summer home on the vineyard. It was winter and they weren't using it, so they suggested my uncle go there to get away from everything. My uncle kicked his heroin habit but still suffered from depression and couldn't find a job on the island. He went into some nearby woods to hang himself. But as he was about to go through with it, Tubby Rebello happened by. Tubby talked him out of killing himself and helped him get a job. My uncle fell in love with Martha's Vineyard and found solace and peace on the island that summer. He invited my grandparents to visit him. My uncle took my grandparents to dinner at Tubby's restaurant. They met the Rebellos and hit it off with them. My uncle moved to Boston. He lived another 10 years. After my uncle's passing, my grandparents read his journal and discovered that Tubby had saved their son's life a decade earlier. I remember when I was a kid, Tubby and Marilyn came to dinner at my grandparents' summer place in Dennis on Cape Cod. They were delightful and Tubby was a fantastic storyteller. I'll never forget them. In 2022, I finally got to visit Martha's Vineyard. Sadly, Chris Rebello died of a heart attack 6 months after I met him in 2000. He was 37. My first stop was his grave. I thanked him for encouraging me all those years ago. I hope my words somehow reached him. Because of him, I'm a tour guide.